While a lot more is known about the coronavirus today than when it began to spread after the first of the year, it has still altered life in America. As I said before, the virus is real. People have died from it, but most have not. I had it. I recovered just fine. Depending upon the way the numbers are crunched, the recovery rate is somewhere between 95 and 99%. But the sensationalizing that has surrounded the coverage of the coronavirus has fueled fears, changed behaviors, and empowered elected officials to put fundamental rights and freedoms at risk. Now, President Trump has been repeatedly pointing to the efforts that are underway to change voting rules as we approach the 2020 national election. Now, are his concerns valid? They've been dismissed by the press. But do we have reason to believe that changing the rules this late in the process could foster fraud and undermine the results of the 2020 election? Hans von Spakovsky is manager of the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative and a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. In 2017, President Trump appointed him to the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. He has served on the Federal Elections Commission and as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Justice Department, providing expertise in enforcing Voting Rights Acts, the Voting Rights Act, and the Help America Vote Act of 2020. He is the co-author of the book, Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. Hans, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let me just jump right into this. Is this something we should be concerned about? Is there fraud in our election system?
Yeah, there sure is, even though the left keeps trying to deny it. Back in 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Indiana's photo ID law. It was one of the first such laws passed in the country for in-person voting. And when they upheld it, they said the U.S. has a long history of voter fraud. It's been documented by historians and journalists, and it could particularly make the difference in a close election. And that, of course, is the key. We have close elections all the time in this country. I know folks right now concentrating on the presidential election, but we have very close elections at the local level, city and town council races, state legislative races, et cetera, and that's where we really ought to be worried about it.
And of course, Hans, you have documented many, hundreds of cases of this at the Heritage Foundation because you have a database of these and you show where election outcomes have been altered. And I want to get into that for just a moment. But before we go any further, I want to define what we're talking about. Now, the concern is not over normal or even expanded absentee voting that is conducted with the normal safeguards. We're talking about something else that's being pushed right now. Explain that to our listeners.
Yeah, because a lot of people don't understand the difference. Look, in 45 states, the District of Columbia, you vote in person normally, but you can also vote by absentee ballot. In some of those states, you need an excuse to do it. You know, you're sick, you're physically disabled, you won't be able to make it to a polling place on election day like our overseas military folks. In other states, you don't need an excuse. So usually a pretty small percentage of people take advantage of that. That's very different than 5 states, which unfortunately have switched over to all mail elections. It includes Oregon, Washington State, Hawaii also, in which they simply mail an absentee or mail-in ballot to every single registered voter. Now, the difference here is that in the other states where there's in-person voting, you actually have to request the absentee ballot.
Right.
You know, you normally have to fill out a form, provide them with your registration information, your name, your registered address, and you have to sign it and send it into election officials. That gives them some opportunity to try to authenticate it, for example, comparing your signature on the form to the signature they have on file for you to make sure you're real, you're really the voter. That's very different from the 5 states that simply mail out ballots because they're simply sending one to everybody they show as registered. And Tony, you and I both know voter registration rolls are in notoriously poor condition all over the country because states don't do a good job of keeping them accurate, of taking off people who've moved out of state, people who have died. And many of the voter rolls are just filled with names they shouldn't. Last year, Judicial Watch forced L.A. to settle a lawsuit they'd filed. L.A. agreed to take 1.5 million voters off its roll, people who shouldn't be on there because they no longer live in L.A. Think about what would happen if you had an all-mail election and 1.5 million ballots were mailed out to individuals who no longer live.
Yeah, and considering California's laws as well that allows ballot harvesting, I mean, you've got 1.5 million ballots floating out there that people can just collect, mark, and turn in. Do you think that could alter the outcome of an election?
Yeah, it certainly could, because the only thing that would prevent that from happening is if election officials catch that the signature doesn't on the ballot doesn't match the signature on file. But listen, when they're processing millions of ballots, clerks spend almost no time actually doing that. They just accept ballots, even in the states that actually try to do that. The average time I heard from an election official that they have to compare the two signatures is like 3 seconds.
Mm-hmm. But the rules that are being pushed are trying to be adopted actually do away with even the identification of the voter. So, I mean, we're talking about a wild, wild west scenario, basically, where anything goes in terms of these mail-in ballots. In your research, is there a particular, I mean, and when your research covers all types of voter fraud, but is there a tool of choice when it comes to those who want to perpetrate fraud on our system?
Yeah, it's absentee ballots. And in fact, that's the largest number of cases in our database. And look, it's common sense to understand why. Those are the easiest ballots to steal, to alter, to forge, or to pressure voters with, because they're the only kind of ballots that aren't voted under the supervision of election officials, which is what you get in a polling place, and outside the watchful eye of poll observers. Mm-hmm. So all of that makes folks very vulnerable to this, and particularly vulnerable to pressure by political candidates or campaign staffers and others who show up at your door and push you to vote the way they want you to vote.
So, Hans, let's talk specifics, because some would say, well, yeah, okay, so you're saying it's out there, but it's not real. I mean, you've documented, as I said, hundreds and hundreds of cases, but have elections been altered as a result of fraud? I mean, the outcome of those elections, could you say, looking at the fact that there was so much fraud in a particular election, that the outcome could have clearly been altered?
Oh, sure. And I actually I got so tired of hearing that, well, even if fraud occurs, it never makes a difference. I actually just published a paper. It's available at the Heritage Foundation website on 4 elections that were overturned because of ballot fraud. It starts in the 1990s. It covers the 2000s. And the latest case was in 2018, just 2 years ago, in North Carolina. And that was actually a congressional election that was overturned because of fraud and other kind of illegal conduct involving absentee ballots. Heck, we just added a guy who was a mayor in Alabama who was removed from office last year after he was convicted of absentee ballot fraud in an election that he only won by 16 votes.
And there was just a recent case that's still unfolding in New Jersey.
Yes,
where it appears to be pretty significant voter fraud.
Yeah, it's Paterson, New Jersey. They held a municipal election recently. They decided to have an all-mail election because everybody was pushing them to do it. 4 locals, including a city council member and a city council member-elect, have already been criminally charged with fraud involving those absentee or mail-in ballots. And the evidence that's starting to surface includes everything from voters who were recorded as voting saying, well, I never got an absentee ballot, to evidence that one of the candidates may have used his campaign staffers to engage in wholesale forging of fraudulent ballots and sending them in.
So, Hans, we're out of time here, but very quickly, last question. Should Americans be concerned about the changing of the voting rules as we approach the election?
They should, and they should demand from local election officials that they have the opportunity to vote in person with the same kind of safety protocols in place that they see when they go to their grocery store or their pharmacy.
All right, Hans von Spakovsky, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure thing, anytime.